The apartment was quiet except for the soft sound of breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside. Jacob Rivera lay on his side, facing the wall, while Peter Watson sat cross-legged on the floor beside the bed, laptop balanced on his knees, the blue glow of the screen illuminating his face in the darkness. It was 3 in the morning, and this had become their routine over the past 2 weeks. Jacob would ask Peter to stay up while he slept, claiming he felt safer with someone nearby, and Peter would agree, spending the night writing or reading, stealing glances at his roommate's peaceful face. Peter's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he wasn't really working anymore. He was watching the rise and fall of Jacob's chest, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the slight smile that sometimes appeared on his lips while he dreamed. Peter had never felt anything like this before, this overwhelming need to protect and care for someone, this desperate longing that kept him awake even when Jacob was sleeping soundly beside him. Jacob stirred, rolling over to face Peter, his eyes fluttering open. In the dim light, Peter could see the vulnerability there, the same expression that had appeared 3 weeks ago when Jacob first asked if Peter would mind staying nearby while he slept. "You're still awake," Jacob whispered, his voice rough with sleep. "I told you I would be," Peter replied softly, closing his laptop and setting it aside. "How are you feeling?" Jacob stretched, his shirt riding up slightly, and Peter forced himself to look away. "Better. I always sleep better when you're here." He paused, studying Peter's face. Peter said quickly, then felt heat rise in his cheeks. Quote Siska. Jacob sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. Code 7. Peter's heart began to race. Of course. Do you ever think about what it would be like if things were different between us? The question hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Peter felt his world tilt slightly on its axis, the careful balance he'd maintained for months suddenly shifting. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how a simple roommate arrangement had evolved into something that kept Peter awake at night with longing, we need to go back to the beginning. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, Peter had been desperate for a place to live. His previous roommate had moved out suddenly, leaving Peter unable to afford the rent on his own. The ad on Craigslist had been simple. Graduate student seeking responsible roommate. Clean, quiet, respectful, no drama. When Peter had called the number, Jacob's voice had been warm but professional, and they'd arranged to meet that same afternoon. Peter remembered walking up to the apartment building, a converted Victorian house in a tree-lined neighborhood near the university. Jacob had answered the door with a smile that made Peter's stomach do an unexpected flip. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and brown eyes that seemed to see everything. He wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, but something about the way he carried himself suggested confidence and kindness in equal measure. "You must be Peter," Jacob had said, extending his hand. "Come on in. Let me show you around." The apartment was perfect, hardwood floors, large windows, a kitchen with actual counter space. Jacob's room was at one end of the hall, and the spare room at the other, with a shared bathroom in between. Everything was clean and organized, but not sterile. There were books everywhere, plants on the windowsills, a guitar leaning against the wall in the living room. Jacob had explained as they sat at the small dining table, discussing practical matters. Tour 14. Peter had nodded, trying to focus on the conversation instead of the way Jacob's eyes crinkled when he smiled. "That all sounds great. I'm working on my PhD in literature, so I'm usually buried in books. I'm pretty quiet too." "Perfect." Jacob had leaned back in his chair, seeming to relax. "To be honest, I was worried I'd end up with someone who'd have people over all the time or leave dishes in the sink for weeks." "Definitely not me," Peter had assured him. "I'm probably too boring for most people's taste." "I doubt that," Jacob had said, and something in his tone had made Peter look up sharply. But Jacob was already standing, moving to clear their coffee cups. "So when would you want to move in?" That had been the beginning. Peter had moved in the following week, and they'd fallen into an easy routine. Jacob was working on his thesis about sleep disorders and anxiety, spending long hours at the university lab, or hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table. Peter divided his time between the library and his own desk in his room, emerging periodically to make tea or grab something from the refrigerator. They were compatible roommates from the start. Jacob was neat without being obsessive, quiet but not antisocial. He cooked dinner most nights and always made enough for two, calling out to ask if Peter wanted to join him. They'd eat together at the small table, talking about their work, their families, random observations about the world. Jacob was funny in a dry, understated way, and Peter found himself looking forward to these conversations more than he probably should have. The first sign that something was different came about 6 weeks after Peter moved in. Jacob had been dating a woman named Carol Foster, a fellow graduate student in his program. Peter had met her a few times when she came by the apartment, and she seemed nice enough. Pretty, smart, laughed at Jacob's jokes. But Peter noticed that Jacob never seemed particularly excited about their dates, never talked about her with the enthusiasm Peter would have expected from someone in a new relationship. One evening in late October, Peter was reading in the living room when Jacob came home from what Peter assumed was a date with Carol. But instead of the relaxed, happy demeanor Peter expected, Jacob looked frustrated and tired. Quote 22, Peter said, looking up from his book. Quote 23, Jacob dropped onto the couch beside him with a heavy sigh. Quote 24, he rubbed his face with both hands. Quote 25, Peter closed his book, giving Jacob his full attention. Quote 26, quote 27, the question was so unexpected that Peter wasn't sure how to respond. What do you mean? Jacob was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. Carol is great. She's smart and funny and beautiful, and she likes me. We have things in common, we get along well. On paper, it's perfect. But, Peter prompted gently, but I feel like I'm playing a part, like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not, or pretending to feel things I don't actually feel. Jacob looked up at Peter, his expression confused and a little lost. Does that make sense? Peter felt something twist in his chest. It makes perfect sense, he said softly. Sometimes we think we want something because it's what we're supposed to want, not because it's what we actually want. Exactly. Jacob leaned back against the couch cushions. I keep thinking there's something wrong with me. She's perfect. So why don't I feel anything? Peter wanted to reach out, to comfort Jacob somehow, but he kept his hands firmly in his lap. There's nothing wrong with you. Maybe she's just not the right person. Maybe. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Can I tell you something else? Of course, I feel more comfortable talking to you right now than I did during my entire dinner with her. Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper. Chapter 42. Peter's heart began to race, but he kept his voice steady. It says you trust me. It says we're good friends. Jacob turned to look at him directly. Is that what we are? Friends? The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Peter felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong word would send him tumbling into something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Peter asked carefully. Jacob held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away. Well, town, but Peter couldn't forget. That conversation replayed in his mind for days afterward. The way Jacob had looked at him, the vulnerability in his voice, the question that seemed to suggest Jacob was feeling something similar to what Peter had been trying to ignore for weeks. Because the truth was, Peter had been attracted to Jacob from the moment they met. Not just physically, though Jacob was undeniably handsome, but something deeper. The way Jacob listened when Peter talked about his research, asking thoughtful questions and remembering details from previous conversations. The way he hummed while he cooked, unconsciously swaying to music only he could hear. The way he left little notes on Peter's door when he was going to be out late, so Peter wouldn't worry. Peter had never been in a serious relationship with a man before. He'd dated women throughout college and graduate school, relationships that had been pleasant but ultimately unfulfilling. He'd always assumed he just hadn't met the right person yet. But living with Jacob had awakened something in him that he'd never experienced before, a longing that went beyond simple attraction. He wanted to wake up next to Jacob every morning. He wanted to cook breakfast for him and listen to him talk about his dreams. He wanted to be the person Jacob turned to when he was confused or upset, the person who made him feel safe and understood. He wanted to kiss him, to hold him, to tell him that there was nothing wrong with him, that he was perfect exactly as he was. But Jacob was straight, as far as Peter knew. He was dating Carol, even if he seemed confused about his feelings for her. And Peter was just his roommate, his friend. Wanting more would be selfish and potentially destructive to the comfortable life they'd built together. The situation with Carol resolved itself 2 weeks later when Jacob came home and announced that they decided to stop seeing each other. It was mutual, Jacob explained as they ate dinner together. We both realized we were better as friends. I'm sorry, Peter said, though he wasn't sure he meant it. Quote 50, Jacob replied. Quote 15, he paused, pushing food around on his plate. Quote 50, quote you shouldn't. Quote when Jacob looked up at Peter. Quote on Peter's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. What did you tell her? That I didn't know what she meant. Jacob's voice was quiet. Quote found. They finished dinner in contemplative silence, and afterward, Jacob disappeared into his room for the rest of the evening. Peter tried to read, but he couldn't concentrate. Jacob's words kept echoing in his mind, saving his real self for someone else. Peter wondered if Jacob had any idea who that someone else might be. The shift in their dynamic was subtle at first. Jacob started spending more time in the common areas of the apartment, working at the kitchen table instead of in his room, watching television on the couch in the evenings. He began initiating conversations more often, asking Peter about his day, his research, his thoughts on random topics. One evening in early November, Peter was grading papers at the dining table when Jacob emerged from his room with his own laptop and settled into the chair across from him. Quote 59, Jacob asked, quote 60, and then Peter replied, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened at Jacob's proximity. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the clicking of keyboards and the occasional rustle of papers. Peter found it difficult to concentrate with Jacob so close, stealing glances at him over his laptop screen. Jacob was wearing a soft blue sweater that brought out his eyes, and he had a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking that Peter found incredibly distracting. Can I ask you something? Jacob said suddenly, looking up from his screen. Sure. Have you ever been in love? Really in love? Not just thinking you were? The question caught Peter off guard. Why do you ask? I'm trying to figure out if I've ever actually felt it or if I've just been convincing myself I have. Jacob leaned back in his chair. All my relationships have felt the same. Pleasant, comfortable, but not consuming. Not like what people write about in books or show in movies. Peter set down his pen, giving Jacob his full attention. What do you think real love would feel like? I don't know. That's the problem. Jacob was quiet for a moment, then continued. I think it would feel like coming home, like finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing, like you could talk to that person for hours and never get bored, like you could sit in silence with them and feel completely content. Peter's chest tightened. Jacob was describing exactly how Peter felt about him. Quote 71, Jacob continued. Quote 70 about quote occurred, Peter managed to say. Jacob looked at him directly. Quote, Peter felt like he was standing at another crossroads, another moment where he could either tell the truth or protect himself with a lie. Quote 7, he said quietly. Quote 7, quote sounded. Jacob's expression softened with sympathy. I'm sorry, that must have been difficult. It is, Peter said, then caught himself. It was. It was difficult. Jacob studied his face. Is that why you moved out of your last place? Because of this person? Peter realized he'd revealed more than he intended. Peter said before he could stop himself. Jacob's eyes widened slightly. There's someone you work with? Peter couldn't bring himself to answer, couldn't bring himself to lie anymore, but also couldn't tell the truth. He just looked down at his papers, pretending to be absorbed in his grading. Quote 87, Jacob said softly. Quote Bob, Peter mumbled, not looking up. Quote 89. Reluctantly, Peter raised his eyes to meet Jacob's gaze. There was something different in Jacob's expression, a new awareness that made Peter's heart race with both hope and terror. Is it someone I know? Jacob asked gently. Peter couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truth. Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke again. The question hung in the air like a live wire, dangerous and electric. Peter felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling, all his defenses failing at once. Peter said quickly, standing up and gathering his papers. What a three? Hoti four. Jacob said, reaching out to catch Peter's wrist. Please don't run away. The touch sent electricity up Peter's arm and he froze. Jacob's hand was warm and gentle, his thumb brushing over Peter's pulse point. Peter said, though they both knew he was lying. Code 97. Jacob's grip tightened slightly. But I need to tell you something. Peter's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Jacob could hear it. Quote 90. Quote 100. Jacob's voice was steady but quiet. And I think she was right. Peter stared at him, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe. I think the reason I couldn't feel anything real with her, or with anyone else, is because I was already feeling it with someone else. Someone I see every day, someone who makes me feel safe and understood and completely myself. Jacob paused. Someone who stays up late to keep me company when I can't sleep, who listens to me ramble about my research without getting bored, who makes even ordinary moments feel special. Jacob, Peter whispered. I think I'm in love with you, my bun, Jacob said simply. And I think I have been for a while, but I was too scared to admit it, even to myself. Peter felt tears prick at his eyes. Are you sure? Because I can't. I can't handle it if you're just confused, if you change your mind. Jacob stood up, still holding Peter's wrist, and stepped closer. What 28? Kadmaran. Peter breathed. Koduwadan. Jacob's face broke into a smile that was radiant and relieved. Really? Really, I've been going crazy trying to hide it. Jacob laughed, a sound of pure joy. We're both idiots. Probably, Peter agreed, smiling through his tears. Jacob reached up with his free hand to cup Peter's face. Peter whispered. The kiss was everything Peter had imagined and more. Soft at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid the other might disappear. But when Peter responded, threading his fingers through Jacob's hair, the kiss deepened into something urgent and desperate. Months of longing poured into a single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jacob rested his forehead against Peter's. Jacob whispered. Peter agreed, his voice shaky. Code 119. They stood there for a moment, holding each other, processing what had just happened. Code 21. Jacob admitted quietly. Code 21. Code 12. Peter pulled back to look at him. Code 21. Code 24. Jacob said, then laughed. Code 25. Peter's heart felt like it might burst. We have time. We have all the time in the world. Jacob kissed him again, softer this time, full of promise rather than desperation. Stay with me tonight? Jacob asked when they separated. I mean, actually with me this time, not just sitting on the floor. Peter smiled. I thought you'd never ask. They moved to Jacob's room, and Peter was struck by how different it felt to be there with permission, with invitation. Jacob's bed was unmade from that morning, and there were books scattered on the nightstand, a glass of water, the small lamp that cast everything in warm, golden light. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Peter down beside him. I have to tell you something else. What? All those nights I asked you to stay up while I slept, I wasn't really having trouble sleeping. Peter raised an eyebrow. No, I just wanted you near me. I wanted an excuse to have you in my room, to fall asleep knowing you were there. Jacob looked embarrassed. I know it was manipulative. It wasn't manipulative, Peter said softly. It was sweet, and it worked, because I wanted to be here. Jacob smiled and leaned in to kiss him again. This time Peter let himself get lost in it, let himself enjoy the feeling of Jacob's hands in his hair, the warmth of Jacob's body pressed against his. When they lay down together, Peter curled against Jacob's side, his head on Jacob's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Jacob's arms wrapped around him, holding him close, and Peter felt a sense of rightness that he'd never experienced before. Peter? Jacob's voice was drowsy. Quote 139. Quote Warty. Quote Warman. Peter pressed a kiss to Jacob's chest. Thank you for figuring it out. Jacob's hand stroked through Peter's hair. I love you. I love you too. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and Peter slept better than he had in months. Peter woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through Jacob's curtains and the unfamiliar but wonderful sensation of Jacob's arms still around him. Jacob was already awake, watching Peter with a soft smile. "Good morning," Jacob murmured, pressing a kiss to Peter's forehead. Quote 146. Peter stretched, enjoying the way Jacob's arms tightened around him. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," Jacob replied. "Turns out I really do sleep better with someone nearby. I just had the wrong someone in mind." Peter laughed. "I'm glad we sorted that out." They lay there for a while, talking quietly, sharing gentle kisses, marveling at how natural it felt to be together like this. Eventually, the need for coffee drove them out of bed, and they made breakfast together in the kitchen, moving around each other with an easy familiarity that felt like they'd been doing this for years. Quote one, Peter asked as they sat at the table with their coffee and toast. Quote Antonum, quote one, Peter trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Jacob reached across the table to take his hand. Jacob squeezed Peter's hand in. "I know it might be complicated, and I know I might make mistakes while I'm figuring things out. But I'd rather make mistakes with you than play it safe with anyone else." Peter felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I want to try too." They spent the rest of the morning together, and then Jacob had to leave for a research meeting at the university. He kissed Peter goodbye at the door, a gesture so natural and domestic that it made Peter's heart skip. "Quanto affardito," Jacob said. "Questa 61. After Jacob left, Peter wandered around the apartment in a daze. Everything looked the same, but everything felt different. The couch where they'd had so many conversations, the kitchen table where they'd shared so many meals, the hallway between their rooms that had seemed like an insurmountable distance just yesterday. He called his best friend, Ronald Martinez, who lived across the country. Quote 162. Peter had mentioned Jacob to Ronald several times over the past few months, probably more than he should have, always careful to keep his tone casual. Quote 163, Peter said. Quote 164. Quote 165 ton. Quote 166. Peter told Ronald everything, from the beginning to the confession to waking up in Jacob's arms that morning. Ronald listened without interruption, and when Peter finished, there was a moment of silence. "Peter," Ronald said finally, "you sound happier than I've heard you in years. I feel happier than I've been in years. I'm glad. You deserve this. You deserve someone who sees how amazing you are." "Thanks, Ron. I'm still processing it all." "That's normal. Just remember to enjoy it, okay? You have a tendency to overthink things." "I'll try." After they hung up, Peter tried to focus on his work, but he found himself checking the clock every few minutes, counting down the hours until Jacob would be home. When 4 o'clock finally arrived, Peter was waiting by the window, watching for Jacob's familiar figure to appear on the sidewalk. Jacob came through the door with a smile that lit up his entire face, and Peter felt his heart do that familiar flip. "Hi," Jacob said, dropping his bag and crossing the room to where Peter stood. "Hi yourself." Jacob cupped Peter's face in his hands and kissed him thoroughly, and Peter thought he could get used to this kind of homecoming. Quote 176. Peter asked when they separated. Quote Wasserman, quote one and quote Oman. Peter felt tears prick at his eyes. Quote Waston. Jacob's expression grew serious. "Peter, I need you to know something. This isn't just because I'm lonely, or because you're convenient, or because I'm experimenting. This is real for me. You're real for me." "I know," Peter said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." "Good, because I never want you to doubt that." They cooked dinner together, pasta with vegetables from the farmer's market, working side by side in the small kitchen. Jacob kept finding excuses to touch Peter, a hand on his lower back as he moved past him, fingers brushing as they reached for the same spoon, a kiss pressed to Peter's temple while he stirred the sauce. "I can't stop touching you," Jacob admitted with a laugh. "Is that weird?" "If it's weird, then I'm weird too," Peter replied, leaning into Jacob's warmth. After dinner, they settled on the couch to watch a movie, but neither of them paid much attention to the screen. They were too busy talking, kissing, exploring this new dynamic between them. Peter marveled at how Jacob seemed to have shed some invisible weight, how much more relaxed and genuine he seemed. Peter said during a quiet moment. Till we see that Jacob was quiet for a moment, thinking. Could I win? Peter remembered he'd been miserable for 3 days and Jacob had brought him soup and tea, checked on him every few hours, even slept on the couch so he'd be nearby if Peter needed anything. Quote-minded Jacob's voice was soft. That's when I knew it wasn't just friendship. Why didn't you say anything? Because I was terrified. I'd never felt that way about a man before, and I didn't know what it meant. I thought maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't. No, it just got stronger. Every day, every conversation, every moment we spent together just made it more obvious that I was falling in love with you. Peter kissed him then, pouring all his love and gratitude into the gesture. When they broke apart, Jacob rested his head on Peter's shoulder. "Flumayede," Jacob asked. "Kotuman," Kotudahar, Peter admitted. "Kotutuan," Jacob laughed. "On Kotuano." "Kotutuathuran," Kotutuarn, Kotsuam. Jacob lifted his head to look at Peter. "Kotutusan," Kotutusaran, Kotutonan. Peter felt overwhelmed by the sincerity in Jacob's voice. "I love things about you too." "Like what?" "Your kindness, the way you hum when you cook, the way you remember little details about people's lives, the way you make me feel safe and understood, the way you're brave enough to change your whole understanding of yourself because you found something real." Jacob kissed him again, and this time it was different, deeper, more urgent, full of months of suppressed desire finally given permission to surface. "Peter," Jacob murmured against his lips. "Yeah? I want you. I want to be with you completely." Peter's heart raced. Quote, "Tushharted in farm fine," quote, "achadum." They made their way to Jacob's room, hands intertwined, both nervous and excited. Jacob closed the door behind them and turned to face Peter, his expression vulnerable but determined. "I should probably tell you," Jacob said quietly. "I don't really know what I'm doing here." "That's okay," Peter replied, stepping closer. "We'll figure it out together." "I just don't want to disappoint you." Peter cupped Jacob's face in his hands. Quote, "Taton." Jacob nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Quote, "Tondamo." Quote, "Dubanarno." They took their time exploring this new aspect of their relationship with gentle hands and whispered words of affection. Jacob was tentative at first, but as Peter responded with encouragement and obvious pleasure, he grew more confident, more sure of himself. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Jacob's bed, both breathing heavily, both smiling. "That was," Jacob began, then trailed off. "Amazing," Peter finished. "That was amazing. I never knew it could feel like that. So connected. So right." Peter pressed a kiss to Jacob's chest. Whoa, did you 29? Jacob's arms tightened around him. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Good scared or bad scared?" "Good scared, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you're about to jump, but also knowing you can fly." Peter smiled against Jacob's skin. "Go, Tom." They talked quietly until they fell asleep, and Peter woke several times during the night just to reassure himself that this was real, that Jacob was really there beside him, that this wasn't just an elaborate dream. The next few weeks passed in a blur of happiness. They settled into their new dynamic with surprising ease, as if they'd been together for years rather than days. Jacob was affectionate and attentive, always finding ways to touch Peter, to show his love through small gestures. He left notes in Peter's books, brought him coffee in bed on weekend mornings, kissed him goodbye every time one of them left the apartment. Peter had never experienced anything like it. All his previous relationships, had felt like work, like he was constantly trying to be someone he wasn't in order to make them work. With Jacob, everything felt natural and effortless. They could spend hours talking or sit in comfortable silence. They could cook together, read together, exist in the same space without needing constant entertainment or stimulation. Quote 234. Peter confessed one evening as they lay in bed together. Quote 223, my for quote the sorry, quote to us. Jacob rolled on over to face him, his expression serious. Quote to down, Potter met his eyes. Quote to on and quote to ban, quote one. Jacob interrupted gently. Quote to on. Peter felt some of the tension leave his body. Quote to far semi quote to Jacob continued with a smile, quote and quote tears and quote 3 weeks after their first kiss, Jacob suggested they tell their friends and families about their relationship. Peter was nervous about the idea, worried about how people would react, but Jacob was confident and reassuring. Quote 248, Jacob said. Quote 249, they started with their friends. Ronald was thrilled, as Peter had expected. Jacob's best friend from graduate school, Gary Patel, was surprised but supportive. I always wondered why you never seemed really happy with any of the women you dated, Gary told Jacob over coffee. Now it makes sense. Jacob's family was a bigger challenge. His parents were traditional and religious, and Jacob was nervous about their reaction. But when he called them and explained that he was in love with someone important to him, someone who made him happy, they were cautiously supportive. Quote 252. His mother said when Jacob put the call on speaker so Peter could participate. Quote 253. Peter's family was easier. His parents had always been accepting and open-minded, and they welcomed Jacob with warmth and enthusiasm when Peter brought him home for Thanksgiving. I can see why you fell for him, Peter's mother whispered to him while Jacob was helping his father with the dishes. Chapter 255, quote 256. Peter replied, watching Jacob laugh at something his father had said. As winter turned to spring, their relationship deepened and strengthened. They developed routines and traditions, inside jokes and shared memories. Jacob started talking about the future in a way that included Peter, making plans for summer vacation, discussing the possibility of getting a larger apartment together when their lease was up. 257. Jacob said one evening as they walked hand in hand through the neighborhood, Peter replied, us, second. Peter stopped walking and turned to face Jacob. Quote 1. Jacob smiled and kissed him right there on the sidewalk, not caring who might see them. One evening in early May, Jacob came home from the university with an excited expression on his face. He announced as soon as he walked through the door. Quote 263, Peter asked, looking up from his laptop. Quote 264. Jacob dropped his bag and crossed the room to where Peter was sitting on the couch. Quote 2sayim. Peter's eyes widened. Jacob had applied for a prestigious research fellowship that would fund his PhD and provide him with a stipend for the next 4 years. It was incredibly competitive, and Jacob had been trying not to get his hopes up. Jacob, that's amazing. Peter jumped up and threw his arms around Jacob's neck. Quote 267. Jacob spun him around, both of them laughing. Quote 267. Quote Santo. Jacob set Peter down and cupped his face into his hands. Quote Aslan. Quote as Peter felt tears prick at his eyes. Quote and quote Shime. They went to a small Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting and candles on every table. Jacob held Peter's hand across the table while they ate, talking animatedly about his research plans and what the fellowship would mean for his career. There's something else, Jacob said as they shared dessert. The fellowship is based here, so I won't have to move. We can stay in the apartment. We can keep building our life together. Peter smiled. That's the best part of the whole thing. Agreed. On the walk home, Jacob stopped suddenly and pulled Peter into a small park they'd passed dozens of times but never entered. Quote 279. Peter asked, laughing. Quote 272. Peter's heart began to race. Jacob. Jacob took both of Peter's hands in his. Quote down, quote on, quoting on. Peter felt tears streaming down his face. Quote twam. Jacob kissed him then, pouring all his love and joy and hope into the gesture. When they broke apart, both of them were crying. Quote on, Jacob said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. Quote 87. Inside the box was a simple silver band, elegant and understated. Jacob slipped it onto Peter's right ring finger, and Peter marveled at how perfectly it fit, how right it felt. I love you, Peter whispered. I love you too, always. They walked home hand in hand, both giddy with happiness and the weight of the commitment they just made to each other. The apartment felt different when they entered it, more like a home they were building together than just a place they happened to share. Peter said as they got ready for bed. Jacob replied, wrapping his arms around Peter from behind as they stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Quote Jacob pressed a kiss to Peter's neck. I'm glad I figured it out. I'm glad we found each other. They made love that night with a new intensity, a new sense of permanence and commitment. Afterward, as they lay in each other's arms, Jacob traced patterns on Peter's chest with his fingertips. Can I tell you something? Jacob said quietly. Always. That first night when I asked you to stay up while I slept, I wasn't really afraid of being alone. I just wanted an excuse to have you close to me, even if I couldn't admit why. Peter smiled in the darkness. I know. I figured that out. You did? You're not a very good actor. And besides, you slept fine when I was there, which wouldn't have been the case if you were really having anxiety about being alone. Jacob laughed softly. You know me too well. I love knowing you. I love learning new things about you every day. Even when I'm being ridiculous and manipulative? Especially then. It shows me how much you wanted me, even when you couldn't say it. Jacob tightened his arms around Peter. I'll never stop wanting you. Good, because I'll never stop wanting you either. The next morning, Peter woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. He found Jacob in the kitchen, humming while he cooked breakfast, wearing nothing but boxers and the smile that had first made Peter's heart skip. Quote 308, Jacob said, turning to kiss Peter thoroughly. Quote 309. Quote 310. Peter wrapped his arms around Jacob's waist. I like the sound of that. Me too. They ate breakfast together at their small table, planning their day, their weekend, their future. Jacob had to go to the university to sign paperwork for the fellowship, and Peter had a dissertation chapter to finish, but they made plans to meet for lunch and spend the afternoon together. I'll pick you up at the library at noon, Jacob said, kissing Peter goodbye at the door. I'll be waiting. Peter spent the morning working on his dissertation, but he found it difficult to concentrate. He kept looking at the ring on his finger, marveling at the weight of it, the promise it represented. He'd never imagined that love could feel like this, so secure and joyful and right. At noon exactly, Jacob appeared at Peter's table in the library, looking handsome and professional in his button-down shirt and dark jeans. Ready for lunch? Jacob whispered. More than ready. They walked to a small cafe near campus, holding hands, talking about their morning, their work, their plans for the weekend. Peter noticed the way other people looked at them, some with curiosity, some with approval, some with disapproval. But he found that he didn't care. He was too happy, too secure in Jacob's love, to be bothered by strangers' opinions. Quote 317, Jacob said as they finished their sandwiches. Quote 300 and quote 300, quote. Peter felt a warmth spread through his chest. Quote 300, quote, yeah, Peter said, smiling. Quote, they spent the weekend looking at apartments, imagining their life in each space, talking about furniture and decorating and the practical details of building a life together. It felt natural and exciting, like they were taking the next logical step in their relationship. On Sunday evening, they found the perfect place. A two-bedroom apartment in an old Victorian house with hardwood floors and large windows and a kitchen big enough for both of them to cook comfortably. There was a small study that would be perfect for Peter's writing, and a living room with a fireplace where they could entertain friends. This is it, Jacob said as they stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through the windows. This is our home. Peter could picture it all, their furniture arranged in the space, books lining the built-in shelves, photos of their families and friends on the mantelpiece. He could imagine lazy Sunday mornings in the kitchen, dinner parties with their friends, quiet evenings reading together by the fireplace. Yes, Peter agreed. This is perfect. Jacob took his hand and spun him around in the empty room, both of them laughing. I love you, Peter Watson. I love you too, Jacob Rivera. They signed the lease that afternoon and made plans to move in at the end of the month. As they walked home to their current apartment, Peter felt a sense of completion, like all the pieces of his life were finally falling into place. The move went smoothly with help from their friends and family. Peter's parents drove up for the weekend to help them get settled, and Jacob's best friend Gary spent Saturday assembling furniture and hanging pictures. By Sunday evening, the apartment looked like a real home, filled with the combined possessions and memories of two people building a life together. I can't believe how perfect this feels, Peter said as they collapsed onto their new couch that evening, exhausted but happy. It feels like we've been here for years, Jacob agreed, pulling Peter closer to his side. Like this was always meant to be our home. They spent their first few weeks in the new apartment, establishing routines and traditions. Jacob claimed the larger bedroom, but Peter's things gradually migrated there too, until they were essentially sharing the space. The second bedroom became Peter's study, filled with his books and research materials, but Jacob often joined him there in the evenings, working on his own projects while Peter wrote. The kitchen became the heart of their home, as Jacob had predicted. They cooked dinner together most nights, experimenting with new recipes, talking about their days, planning for the future. Friends started coming over regularly for dinner parties and game nights, and Peter loved seeing how naturally Jacob played the role of host, how comfortable he was welcoming people into their shared space. "You're glowing," Peter's friend Samantha Morales observed one evening after dinner, as she helped Peter clear the dishes while Jacob entertained their other guests in the living room. Quote 335, quote to 37. Peter glanced into the living room where Jacob was telling a story that had everyone laughing, his face animated and joyful. Quote to 37, quote to read. Summer passed in a blur of happiness. Jacob started his PhD program in the fall, diving into his research with enthusiasm and dedication. Peter defended his dissertation proposal and began the final phase of his graduate work. They supported each other through the stresses and challenges of academic life, celebrating victories and comforting each other through setbacks. One evening in October, as they sat by their fireplace reading, Jacob looked up from his book and studied Peter's face. "What?" Peter asked, noticing the intensity of Jacob's gaze. "What 3-4 doom?" Quote to Vienna and quote one. Peter set aside his book and gave Jacob his full attention. Quote 343. Quote Durn. Peter felt tears prickle at his eyes. Quote Turn. Jacob moved from his chair to the couch beside Peter. Quote Deshaun. Quote in Peter admitted. Quote Brown. Quote Sean. Peter's heart raced. Marriage? Eventually, yes. When we're ready, when the time is right. I want to marry you, Peter. I want to make this official in every way possible. Peter kissed him then, pouring all his love and gratitude and hope into the gesture. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "I want that too," Peter said. "All of it, everything." "Good," Jacob replied, pulling Peter closer. "Because you're stuck with me forever. I'm counting on it." As winter approached, they settled into the comfortable rhythms of their life together. Peter spent long hours in his study, working on his dissertation, while Jacob divided his time between classes, research, and his assistantship. But they always made time for each other, for the small daily rituals that kept them connected. Jacob still had trouble sleeping sometimes, especially when he was stressed about school or research. But now, instead of asking Peter to stay up watching over him, he would simply curl up against Peter's side and let the steady rhythm of Peter's breathing lull him to sleep. "Much better than having you sit on the floor," Jacob murmured one night as they settled into bed together. "Much better," Peter agreed, wrapping his arms around Jacob and pressing a kiss to his hair. One snowy evening in December, Jacob came home from the university with an excited expression on his face. "I have news," he announced, echoing the scene from months earlier when he'd learned about the fellowship. "Quote 360, quote 361. Peter jumped up and hugged him tightly. Quote 362. Quote Para, Jacob said, his smile growing even wider. Quote at 360. Quote, they spent the evening planning their trip, looking at hotels and restaurants and tourist attractions. It would be their first real vacation together, and Peter was excited about the prospect of exploring a new city with Jacob, of supporting him as he presented his research to the academic community. "Well, 366, Peter said as they lay in bed that night, making lists of things they wanted to do in San Francisco. Quote 367. Jacob agreed, setting aside his notebook and pulling Peter into his arms. Quote 368. Quote 369. Peter assured him, pressing a kiss to Jacob's chest. "We're real. This is real. I love you so much. Peter, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. I love you too. Forever and always." The conference in San Francisco was everything they'd hoped for and more. Jacob's presentation was well received, and he made valuable connections with other researchers in his field. Peter was proud to be there supporting him, proud to be introduced as Jacob's partner, proud to see how respected and accomplished Jacob was in his academic community. They spent their free time exploring the city, walking hand in hand through Golden Gate Park, taking the cable cars up and down the steep hills, eating amazing food in Chinatown in North Beach. It felt like a honeymoon, a celebration of how far they'd come and how bright their future looked. On their last night in the city, they had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the bay, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "This has been the best week of my life," Jacob said, reaching across the table to take Peter's hand. "What to 374?" Peter replied. Quote to 375. Quote 367. Quote 367. Jacob was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water. Quote 370. Quote 370. Jacob turned back to face him, his expression serious but hopeful. Quote 380. Peter's heart stopped. "What?" "I know we've talked about marriage in abstract terms, but I want to make it concrete. I want to ask you to marry me, officially. I want to give you a ring and plan a wedding and make promises in front of our families and friends." Peter felt tears streaming down his face. "Are you proposing to me right now?" "Not yet," Jacob said with a smile. "I want to do it properly, with a ring and a plan, but I wanted to know how you'd feel about it first." "I'd feel like the luckiest person in the world," Peter managed to say through his tears. Jacob's smile grew radiant. Quote 87, quote round. Jacob stood up and came around the table to kiss Peter, not caring that they were in a public restaurant, not caring who might be watching. When they broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. Quote 389. Jacob whispered against Peter's forehead, "I love you too, so much." They flew home the next day, both giddy with excitement and the secret they were keeping. Jacob immediately began planning the proposal, recruiting Peter's best friend Ronald and his own friend Gary to help with the details. Peter tried to act surprised when 2 weeks later, Jacob suggested they take a walk through the park where they'd had their first real conversation about love and relationships. He tried to act casual when Jacob led him to a secluded spot near the pond where fairy lights had been strung in the trees and rose petals scattered on the ground. "Peter," Jacob said, dropping to one knee and pulling out a small velvet box, "you changed my life the day you walked into it. You helped me discover who I really am, who I was always meant to be. You've loved me through confusion and fear and uncertainty, and you've made me braver than I ever thought I could be." Peter was crying too hard to speak, but he nodded for Jacob to continue. "I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, supporting you, building dreams with you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Peter sobbed. "Yes, yes, yes." Jacob slipped the ring onto Peter's finger, a beautiful white gold band with a simple diamond that caught the light from the fairy lights above them. Then he stood up and kissed Peter with all the love and joy and promise of their future together. Jacob murmured against his lips. Quote 397. As they walked home hand in hand, both admiring the ring on Peter's finger, both planning their wedding and their future, Peter reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From roommates to friends to lovers to fiancés, each step had felt natural and inevitable, like they were always meant to end up here. "Do you remember that night when you asked me to stay up while you slept?" Peter asked as they climbed the steps to their apartment. "How could I forget? That was the beginning of everything. I knew then that I was falling in love with you. I just never imagined you might fall in love with me too." Jacob stopped on the landing and cupped Peter's face in his hands. "Demanda Cotivam," Jacob said, kissing him softly. "Wucharon Cotivam," Peter replied, looking around at their home, their life, their love. 406 months later, on a perfect spring day, they stood in the garden behind Peter's childhood home, surrounded by their families and friends, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. Peter's father officiated the ceremony, and Jacob's mother cried happy tears as she watched her son marry the man who had brought such joy and authenticity into his life. "I promise to love you through every season of our lives," Jacob said during his vows, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to support your dreams, to comfort you in difficult times, and to celebrate with you in moments of joy. I promise to grow with you, to learn with you, and to build a life with you that honors both of our truths. I promise to be your safe harbor in every storm," Peter replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "I promise to believe in you when you doubt yourself, to remind you of your strength when you feel weak, and to love you exactly as you are while supporting who you're becoming. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of our days." When they kissed as newly married husbands, their friends and family erupted in cheers and applause, but Peter barely heard them. All he could focus on was Jacob's face, radiant with happiness, and the feeling that everything in his life had finally clicked into place. Later, as they danced their first dance as a married couple to a song Jacob had chosen because it reminded him of the night they'd first confessed their love, Peter marveled at how far they'd come. "What for alone?" Jacob asked, spinning Peter gently in his arms. "Quote for to," Peter said with a smile, or "quote for to." Jacob replied. Quote for answer, quote for extra. Jacob pulled Peter closer as the song neared its end. Quote from, Peter agreed, resting his head on Jacob's shoulder. "But I know it's going to be amazing because we're writing it together." As the music faded and their friends and family began to join them on the dance floor, Peter closed his eyes and let himself fully absorb this moment. The man he loved more than life itself was now his husband. They had a home together, careers they were passionate about, families who supported them, and a future full of infinite possibility. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories began in the most ordinary ways, Peter thought. A simple roommate arrangement, a question asked in the darkness, a confession whispered in the safety of friendship. Sometimes the most extraordinary love grew from the most everyday moments, nurtured by patience and honesty and the courage to be vulnerable with another person. As Jacob spun him around once more, both of them laughing with pure joy, Peter knew that their story was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, certainly, and changes and growth and all the beautiful complications of a life shared with another person. But they would face it all together with the same love and commitment and trust that had brought them to this perfect moment. The scared graduate student looking for a roommate could never have imagined that answering that simple ad would lead to this, a love story that began with late-night conversations and gentle care, that grew through honesty and vulnerability, and that culminated in a promise to build a life together. But sometimes the most incredible journeys began with the smallest steps, and sometimes the most profound love stories started with nothing more than one person asking another to stay nearby while they slept. And in the end, Peter thought as he looked into his husband's eyes, that was exactly what they had done. They had stayed nearby, through confusion and discovery, through fear and joy, through all the moments that had led them here. And they would keep staying nearby, for all the years to come, building their love one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time.